A paralyzed billionaire hadn't smiled in 3 long years. The richest doctors failed to help him. The most expensive therapists gave up. Even the woman he planned to marry walked away after his accident. His own family believed the light had disappeared from his eyes forever. Then something impossible happened. One exhausted poor maid, who had worked herself to the point of collapse, accidentally fell asleep beside his bed while holding his hand. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't asking for money. She didn't even know he was awake. When the billionaire opened his eyes and saw her sleeping peacefully beside him, one unexpected act melted the frozen walls around his heart. Moments later, something no one inside the mansion had witnessed in 3 years happened before their very eyes. But that single smile would trigger jealousy, betrayal, humiliation, and a deadly conspiracy that powerful people would do anything to keep buried. Why did this poor maid touch the billionaire's heart when everyone else had failed? What secret were his own family desperately trying to hide from him? And how could one simple act of kindness place an ordinary young woman in the middle of a dangerous battle over $1 billion fortune? Stay with me, because this heartbreaking love story is about to take a shocking turn that no one saw coming. The Hawthorne mansion dominated the highest hill overlooking the city, its towering white columns glowing beneath the morning sun. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway. A fountain sculpted from Italian marble sparkled in front of the entrance, while dozens of gardeners, chefs, drivers, and housekeepers quietly carried out their duties. To the outside world, the estate represented perfection. Inside, it was a prison. On the second floor, behind 2 security doors, Ethan Hawthorne sat in a state-of-the-art motorized wheelchair facing a wall of glass overlooking acres of private land. At 34, he was one of America's youngest billionaires, the founder of Hawthorne Technologies, a company worth tens of billions of dollars. Business magazines once called him the man who never failed. Now he couldn't even lift a hand. His reflection stared back from the window, sharp blue eyes, dark hair kept neatly trimmed. An expensive tailored shirt chosen by someone else. A body that refused to obey him. 3 years had passed since the accident. Not once had he genuinely smiled. Silence filled the room until Nurse Linda entered carrying a silver tray. "Good morning, Mr. Hawthorne." Her voice sounded warm, her eyes did not. She prepared his morning injection with practiced movements. "Time for your medication." Ethan watched the syringe every morning. The same needle, the same sleepy feeling afterward, the same helplessness. Unable to object, he felt the medicine enter his arm. Within minutes his eyelids became heavier. He hated that feeling. Earlier in his recovery, doctors had explained every medication. But over time, explanations disappeared while dosages quietly changed. Ethan had begun noticing a troubling pattern. Whenever lawyers, investors, or board members scheduled meetings, the injections always seemed stronger. When there were no important visitors, the medication returned to its normal level. He couldn't prove anything, but he never stopped noticing. That habit of careful observation had made him a billionaire long before the accident. Losing the use of his body had sharpened the use of his mind. The bedroom door opened again. "Morning, cousin." Ryan Hawthorne walked in wearing a perfectly tailored navy blue suit worth more than many people earned in a month. His polished shoes reflected the sunlight pouring through the windows. He carried a leather folder beneath one arm and wore the confident smile of a successful executive. Officially, Ryan had become acting executive chairman of Hawthorne Technologies after Ethan's accident. Unofficially, he had grown remarkably comfortable occupying Ethan's seat. "Just a few routine documents today," Ryan said pleasantly. He always called them routine, always. He spread several pages across the bedside table. "You know how legal departments are. Endless paperwork." Standing quietly behind him was the family attorney, Martin Doyle. Unlike Ryan, Martin avoided Ethan's eyes. His fingers tightened around his briefcase. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple despite the cool room. Ryan began reading summaries instead of allowing Ethan enough time to examine every page himself. "This one authorizes next quarter's investment schedule." He turned another page. "This simply updates voting authority." Another page. Nothing complicated. Martin shifted uneasily. "Mr. Hawthorne," he finally whispered before stopping himself. Ryan slowly turned toward him. The smile on Ryan's face remained. Only his eyes changed, cold, warning. Martin swallowed the rest of his sentence. "Nothing," he muttered. Ethan saw everything. He had learned that silence often spoke louder than words. Years earlier, while building his company, Ethan had developed an uncanny ability to read meetings before anyone else could. Investors often believed they were hiding their intentions, yet Ethan could spot nervous glances, forced smiles, and tiny hesitations. Those instincts had helped him outmaneuver competitors. Paralysis hadn't taken that gift away, if anything. It had made it stronger. Ryan guided Ethan's thumb toward the electronic signature pad. There we go. Another signature, another document, another piece of control quietly slipping away. As Ryan packed his folder, he smiled again. "Some rest, cousin. Recovery takes patience." Door closed. The room became silent once more. Only then did Ethan slowly blink twice. A habit almost no one noticed years ago when he and his late father played chess. His father had jokingly taught him to blink twice whenever he sensed someone was bluffing. It became a private habit Ethan carried into adulthood. Now, unable to speak freely, those blinks had become one of the few ways he expressed distrust. No one around him understood what they meant. Not yet. Downstairs, a city bus stopped several blocks away from the mansion gates. Grace Carter stepped off carrying an inexpensive canvas bag containing her lunch and an old paperback novel. She walked the remaining distance because saving bus fare mattered. At 24, Grace owned no designer clothes, no jewelry, no savings account, and certainly no mansion. She owned determination. Her neatly pressed housekeeping uniform had been washed so many times its color had faded. Her shoes had been repaired twice. Still, she smiled before walking through the staff entrance. Months earlier, Grace had been among the top students in nursing school. Professors praised her calmness under pressure and her gentle way of speaking with frightened patients. She dreamed of becoming an emergency room nurse. Then life shattered those plans. Her widowed mother, Emily Carter, collapsed at work one afternoon and was diagnosed with advanced kidney disease. Medical insurance covered only a fraction of the treatments. Bills piled up faster than Grace could pay them. One evening, Grace quietly packed away her nursing textbooks. She promised herself it was only temporary. She never told her mother that she had withdrawn from college. Emily believed her daughter still attended classes during the day. Grace couldn't bear to add guilt to her mother's suffering. Every sacrifice she made was for family. That same evening, her little brother Noah had proudly shown her a drawing of a large building. "Look," he said with a grin. "This is your hotel." Grace smiled through tears. "That's beautiful. You clean the biggest hotel in the city, right?" She kissed his forehead. "Something like that." That day forward, she never corrected him. If believing she worked in a beautiful hotel allowed him to sleep peacefully, she would protect that innocent lie. Now she stood inside Hawthorne Mansion, listening carefully as the head housekeeper, Margaret Collins, inspected the new employees. Margaret had worked for the Hawthorne family for nearly 20 years. Discipline ruled every word she spoke. "You are here to work," Margaret said firmly. "No gossip, no unnecessary conversations, no mistakes." Everyone nodded. Margaret stopped directly in front of Grace. The new maid assigned to the East Wing. "Yes, ma'am." Mr. Hawthorne's floor. Grace straightened instinctively. "I understand." Margaret's expression hardened. "You enter his room only when instructed." "Yes, ma'am." "Never ask him personal questions." "Yes, ma'am." "Never pity him." Grace hesitated. Margaret noticed. "Pity helps no one." Grace lowered her eyes respectfully. "Treat him with dignity." The first time, Margaret looked slightly surprised. Then she walked away without another word. Grace picked up her cleaning cart and began moving through endless hallways decorated with priceless paintings and crystal chandeliers. Everything around her whispered unimaginable wealth. Yet something felt strangely empty. Employees rarely smiled. Conversation stopped whenever certain people approached. A nurse hurried past carrying medication while avoiding everyone's eyes. A security guard glanced toward the second floor before quickly looking away. Tiny moments, easy to ignore. Unless someone paid attention. Grace always paid attention. Her nursing instructors had taught students to notice small changes because lives often depended on them. Pale skin, trembling hands, uneven breathing. Little details revealed hidden truths. Without realizing it, those same instincts were about to draw her into the darkest secret inside Hawthorne Mansion. Far above, Ethan remained by the window, staring toward the gardens below for the briefest moment. He noticed a young maid crossing the courtyard with a cleaning cart. She looked up toward the mansion, took a slow breath, and smiled to herself before walking inside. Neither of them knew it. But destiny had just taken its first quiet step. And somewhere else inside the mansion, Ryan Hawthorne stood alone in his office, locked the door, picked up a secure phone, and spoke only one sentence: "Keep watching him, and make sure the new girl stays exactly where she's supposed to." A voice on the other end replied, "Understood." Ryan slowly smiled. Outside his office, hidden just around the corner, the family lawyer Martin Doyle froze after overhearing those words. His face turned pale. For a moment, it looked as if he wanted to turn back and confront Ryan. Instead, he quietly walked away, carrying a burden that had been eating away at his conscience for 3 long years. Grace pushed her cleaning cart slowly down the long marble hallway of the East Wing, careful not to make a sound. Every crystal vase, antique painting, and polished table reminded her that she was walking through a world she had only seen in magazines. Yet beneath the beauty of Hawthorne Mansion, there was a strange stillness that made her uneasy. The other employees barely spoke to one another. Whenever someone did speak, they lowered their voices as though the walls themselves were listening. Grace had worked in enough wealthy homes to know that rich families often had secrets, but this place felt different. It wasn't just quiet, it felt guarded. As she dusted a hallway table, an elderly butler named Charles approached. "You must be the new girl," he said with a gentle smile. "Yes, sir, I'm Grace." "You don't have to call me sir, Charles is fine." Grace smiled politely. "It's nice to meet you." Charles looked around before lowering his voice. "Just do your work, and stay away from family business." Grace frowned slightly. "Only came here to earn an honest living." "I believe you," Charles replied. "Unfortunately, honesty isn't always enough in this house." Before Grace could ask what he meant, Charles noticed someone approaching and immediately changed the subject. "Flowers need fresh water." He walked away without another word. Grace watched him disappear around the corner, her curiosity growing. It wasn't the first warning she had received that morning. It would not be the last. Upstairs, Ethan Hawthorne stared silently through the windows. The medication had begun making him drowsy again. His eyelids felt heavy. His thoughts remained sharp. He heard every sound beyond the partially opened bedroom door: footsteps, whispering, the rolling wheels of medical equipment. 3 years of silence had taught him something most people never learned. People revealed the truth when they believed no one was listening. A soft knock came. Ryan entered carrying another folder. Behind him walked Nurse Linda. "I think today's dosage should keep him comfortable," she whispered. Ryan glanced toward Ethan before replying quietly, "Good. Won't remember much after sleeping." Ryan nodded. "Exactly what we need." They believed Ethan's mind had become as weak as his body. They couldn't have been more wrong. Unable to move, Ethan's heart pounded against his chest. He wanted to shout, to demand answers. Instead, all he could do was watch as Ryan smiled his usual polished smile. "Cousin," Ryan said loudly, "I hope you're feeling stronger today." Performance had begun again. Ryan opened another folder. Nothing urgent, just more company paperwork. He deliberately positioned himself between Ethan and the documents, allowing only brief glimpses of each page. Martin Doyle entered moments later. Unlike Ryan, he looked exhausted. Dark circles surrounded his eyes. He had barely slept. His conscience had become heavier with every passing month. 3 years earlier, Martin had promised Ethan's late father that he would always protect the Hawthorne family. At the time, he believed protecting the family meant protecting Ryan as well. Now he wasn't so sure. As Ryan continued explaining the documents, Martin noticed Ethan blinking twice. Again, then again. It was subtle, almost invisible. Most people ignored it. Martin didn't. A memory flashed through his mind. Years earlier, during a corporate negotiation, Ethan had blinked twice after spotting forged financial reports presented by a rival company. Later that day, Ethan had quietly explained, "Whenever I blink twice during a meeting, it usually means someone isn't telling the truth." Martin's stomach tightened. Had Ethan been trying to communicate all this time? Meanwhile, Grace finished cleaning another hallway before reaching the second floor. Margaret stopped her immediately. This corridor requires extra care. Grace nodded. I understand. Margaret pointed toward two large double doors guarded by a security officer. Mr. Hawthorne's room. Grace instinctively looked toward the doors. Remember what I told you. I won't disturb him. Margaret studied Grace for several seconds. Something about the young woman reminded her of someone she had known years ago, someone kind. Kindness rarely survived long inside Hawthorne Mansion. I hope so, Margaret finally replied before walking away. Grace began dusting nearby furniture. As she worked, voices drifted from a side hallway. Curiosity made her pause. Ryan's voice. He only needs to sign one more authorization. Another man replied too quietly to recognize. Ryan continued. After that, there'll be nothing left to question. Grace frowned. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop. She simply happened to be nearby. The conversation continued. Board already trusts me. What about Mr. Hawthorne? Ryan laughed softly. He doesn't even know what's happening anymore. Grace's heart skipped. Something about that sentence felt wrong before she could hear another word. What are you doing? Grace jumped. Margaret stood directly behind her. I was dusting. You listening? No, ma'am. Margaret stared into her eyes. Grace held the gaze without fear. She had nothing to hide. After several tense seconds, Margaret spoke. Finish your work. Yes, ma'am. Grace pushed her card away, but Ryan's words echoed inside her mind. He doesn't even know what's happening anymore. Why did that sound less like concern and more like confidence? Later that afternoon, Grace carried fresh towels toward Ethan's room. Nurse Linda stepped outside just as Grace approached. Take those. Grace smiled politely. I was told to replace the towels. I said I'll take them. The nurse's tone had become unusually sharp. Grace handed them over. As Nurse Linda turned away, one towel slipped onto the floor. Get it, Grace said. She bent to pick it up. Before standing, she noticed something unusual. Near the bedside cabinet sat two medication trays. One contained labeled prescription bottles. The other held an unmarked syringe. Grace had spent nearly 2 years studying nursing before leaving school. Unlabeled medication inside a patient's room immediately caught her attention, not because she suspected a crime, because proper hospital procedure never allowed unidentified injections. Before she could study it further, Linda quickly stepped between Grace and the table. Done enough, Grace apologized. I'm sorry. Linda forced a smile. No harm done. Grace left quietly. But the image remained in her mind, an unlabeled syringe. Perhaps it meant nothing. Perhaps it meant everything. The seed of doubt had been planted. That evening, Ethan sat alone once again. The mansion slowly became quieter as staff finished their shifts. From his bedroom window, he watched employees leaving through the staff entrance. Among them, he noticed Grace. Instead of rushing home like everyone else, she stopped outside the gates. She removed a small envelope from her pocket, counted the money inside, smiled sadly, then placed most of it back before keeping only enough for transportation. She was budgeting every dollar. Ethan couldn't hear the conversation that followed, but he watched Grace answer her phone. Her smile disappeared. It's okay, Noah, she said softly. Tell Mom I'll be home soon. She listened. I already ate. It was a lie. She hadn't eaten since dawn. She simply wanted her little brother to believe everything was fine. Ethan watched her board the city bus for reasons he couldn't explain. His eyes followed it until it disappeared from sight. Inside the mansion, Ryan stood in his private study staring at security footage from several hallway cameras. One screen showed Grace cleaning. Another showed Ethan's bedroom. Ryan pressed a button. A security supervisor entered. New maid. Supervisor nodded. What about her? I want reports. Daily, every day. Do you suspect something? Ryan looked back at the screen showing Grace. I don't believe in coincidences. The supervisor waited. Ryan smiled coldly. Kind people have a habit of ruining carefully made plans. As the supervisor walked away, Ryan locked the office door. He opened a hidden drawer beneath his desk. Inside rested a damaged wristwatch. Its cracked glass was stained with dried blood that had never been cleaned away. Ryan stared at it for several long seconds before quietly closing the drawer again. Outside, thunder rumbled far in the distance, not as the beginning of a storm, but as a reminder that buried secrets never remain buried forever. Neither Grace nor Ethan knew it yet, but the countdown to the first devastating betrayal had already begun. Morning arrived with golden sunlight pouring through the towering windows of Hawthorne Mansion, but nothing about the house felt warm. Employees moved through the hallways with the same cautious expressions Grace had begun noticing since her first day. They greeted one another politely, yet every smile seemed measured. Every conversation ended the moment someone important walked by. Grace tightened the ribbon around her hair and pushed her cleaning cart toward the east wing. Despite the mansion's breathtaking beauty, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong beneath its polished surface. As she reached the second floor, Charles, the elderly butler, intercepted her. "Grace," she smiled. "Good morning, Charles." He glanced around to make sure no one was close enough to overhear them. "Are you settling in? Learning?" Charles nodded slowly. "That's good. Just remember." He hesitated before finishing his sentence. "Some people in this house wear expensive smiles to hide dangerous intentions." Grace frowned. "You've warned me twice now." "I know. Should I be worried?" Charles forced a small smile. "You should be careful." Before Grace could ask another question, Margaret called from the end of the hallway. "Grace, Mr. Hawthorne's room needs cleaning after the doctors finish." Grace nodded. "Coming." Charles quietly walked away. His warning lingered in her mind. Earlier that morning, Charles had walked past Ryan's office and overheard an argument through the partially opened door. He hadn't caught every word, but he distinctly heard Ryan say, "The sooner everyone believes Ethan's condition will never improve, the easier this becomes." Charles had worked for Ethan's late father for more than 2 decades. He remembered the promise he had made beside the old man's hospital bed years earlier, to watch over Ethan no matter what happened. For the first time, he wondered whether he had already failed that promise. Inside Ethan's bedroom, 3 specialists finished another neurological examination. One of them sighed quietly. "There's very little change." Another adjusted Ethan's blanket. "We'll continue physical therapy." After they left, Nurse Linda approached with another syringe. Ethan immediately recognized it. The unlabeled one, his heartbeat quickened. She smiled pleasantly. "This will help you relax." Needle entered his arm. Within minutes, the familiar heaviness spread through his body. His mind fought desperately to stay alert. He had begun secretly counting the minutes after every injection. It always happened the same way. First, his fingers became numb. Then his vision blurred. Finally, exhaustion overwhelmed him. Whatever they were giving him, it wasn't helping him recover. It was keeping him quiet. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Margaret stepped inside with Grace. "This is our new housekeeper assigned to this floor," Margaret explained. Grace lowered her head respectfully. "Good morning, Mr. Hawthorne." Ethan slowly turned his eyes toward her for the first time. They truly looked at one another. Grace expected to see emptiness. Instead, she saw intelligence, pain, loneliness, and something else. Hope that refused to die. Margaret handed Grace fresh flowers. "Replace yesterday's arrangement." As Margaret stepped outside to answer a phone call, Grace carefully arranged the flowers near Ethan's window. Neither of them spoke. Only the soft sound of stems sliding into crystal filled the room. Grace smiled gently. "These lilies are beautiful." Ethan watched her. "They remind me of the flowers my dad used to grow." She laughed softly. "Well, he mostly grew vegetables, but Mom insisted on planting flowers beside them." The first time in weeks, Ethan forgot about the pain. Grace continued working. "I guess she wanted something beautiful to look at after pulling weeds all day." She shook her head. "My dad always said flowers teach patience." A brief silence followed. "Miss him?" Her voice became quieter. "He passed away when Noah was just a baby." She quickly smiled again. "But he'd probably scold me for getting emotional while I'm working." Ethan's eyes never left her. 3 years earlier, after his own father died from a sudden heart attack, Ethan had buried himself in work instead of grief. His father had taught him that wealth meant nothing if kindness disappeared. Looking at Grace now, he remembered those words. She wasn't trying to impress him. She simply spoke from the heart. Outside the room, Ryan had just stepped onto the second floor. He paused. Grace's gentle voice drifted through the slightly open door. Ryan frowned. "Who's inside?" Margaret answered immediately. "New maid." Ryan glanced through the narrow opening. Ethan's eyes were fixed entirely on Grace. That hadn't happened with anyone else. Not once in 3 years. Ryan's smile disappeared. Interesting. He quietly continued walking, but his mind remained on what he had just witnessed. Later that afternoon, Grace returned carrying fresh towels. This time Ethan was alone. She carefully folded the blankets. As she worked, she noticed a framed photograph lying face down on a shelf. Curious, she picked it up to dust beneath it. The picture showed Ethan standing beside a smiling older man in front of Hawthorne Technologies' first office. Both wore jeans instead of suits. Both looked genuinely happy. Grace smiled. "So that's your dad." She carefully wiped the frame. "You have his eyes." Ethan stared at the photograph. A painful memory flooded his mind. His father laughing after Ethan signed his very first business contract. His father refusing to let success change their values. His father's final advice: "If you ever become the richest man in the room, make sure you're also the kindest." Tears slowly gathered in Ethan's eyes. Grace noticed immediately. "Oh." She gently returned the photograph to its place. "I'm sorry." She instinctively reached for a tissue and carefully wiped the tear from his cheek. The gesture lasted only seconds, yet it carried more compassion than Ethan had received in years. She wasn't treating him like a billionaire. She was treating him like a person. Unbeknownst to both of them, a security camera in the corner quietly recorded everything. Elsewhere in the mansion, Martin Doyle sat alone inside the library pretending to review legal files. Instead, he stared at an old newspaper hidden inside his briefcase. The headline read, "Tech billionaire Ethan Hawthorne critically injured in high-speed crash." Martin remembered that night with painful clarity. He had arrived at the accident scene only minutes after emergency responders. Ryan had reached the scene unusually fast, far faster than anyone else should have. At the time, Martin dismissed it as coincidence. Now, he wasn't so certain. The blood-stained watch hidden inside Ryan's desk flashed across Martin's memory. A cold chill ran through him. Had he ignored clues that had been there from the very beginning? That evening, Grace finished her shift and prepared to leave. As she walked past Ethan's room one final time, she quietly peeked inside. He was awake. Their eyes met again. She smiled. "I hope tomorrow is a better day for you." She didn't expect a response. Instead, she noticed something unusual. Ethan blinked once, then twice, slowly. Deliberately, Grace tilted her head. "Are you trying to tell me something?" Before Ethan could repeat the movement, Nurse Linda entered carrying another syringe. "There you are," she said sharply. "Your shift is over." Grace stepped back. "Good night, Mr. Hawthorne." She walked away, but all the way home, she couldn't stop thinking about those two slow blinks. Most people would have forgotten them. Grace couldn't. During nursing school, one of her professors had taught students that patients who couldn't speak often developed personal ways of communicating. No two patients were exactly alike, perhaps. Those blinks meant nothing, or perhaps they meant everything. Back inside the mansion, Ethan watched the bedroom door close for the first time in 3 years. Someone had looked into his eyes instead of at his fortune. Someone had noticed him. And deep inside Ryan Hawthorne's office, the billionaire's cousin replayed the security footage showing Grace wiping Ethan's tears. He stopped the video, zoomed in, then whispered coldly, "So, you're becoming a problem." Ryan picked up his phone. "Tomorrow," he said to the person on the other end, "we begin phase 2. The call ended. Ryan smiled. He had no intention of allowing a poor maid to destroy 3 years of carefully planned deception. What he didn't realize was that every cruel move he made was bringing him one step closer to the brutal revenge that would eventually cost him everything. The following morning, Hawthorne Mansion looked as flawless as ever. Fresh flowers lined the grand staircase. The marble floors reflected the sunlight streaming through the enormous windows, and a team of staff members quietly prepared for an important luncheon with several members of Hawthorne Technologies' board of directors. To anyone visiting for the first time, the mansion looked like the home of a successful family. Grace was beginning to understand it was something else entirely. As she arranged silverware in the formal dining room, she noticed the employees speaking even more cautiously than usual. One maid whispered, "The board is coming." Another immediately replied, "Keep your voice down." Conversation ended as quickly as it had begun. Grace continued polishing crystal glasses, pretending not to notice. She had learned that the more quietly she observed, the more people revealed. Across the mansion, Ethan's bedroom had become unusually busy. Doctors arrived earlier than normal. Ryan arrived shortly afterward, accompanied by Martin Doyle and 2 executives from Hawthorne Technologies. Nurse Linda prepared Ethan's morning medication, Before she administered the injection, Ryan quietly stepped closer. "Too much today," he murmured. Linda looked surprised. I need him awake just long enough," she nodded. "I understand." Ethan heard every word. It confirmed what he had already suspected. His medication was not being adjusted for his health. It was being adjusted for someone else's convenience. Unable to react, he fixed his eyes on Ryan. Ryan smiled as if nothing had happened. "Good morning, cousin." He held up another stack of documents. "The board will be here in an hour. We just need a few signatures." Martin stood silently near the window. His guilt had become unbearable. The previous evening, unable to sleep, he had reopened the file containing the police report from Ethan's accident. Small details he had ignored years earlier suddenly seemed impossible to dismiss. The report mentioned that the security camera covering the highway entrance had mysteriously stopped recording 8 minutes before the crash. At the time, investigators blamed a technical malfunction. Now Martin wondered if it had been sabotage. That single unanswered question refused to leave his mind. Ryan continued reading summaries of the documents. Ethan noticed something else. One page carried a small red tab. Ryan intentionally skipped over it before moving to the next paper. A tiny detail. Easy to miss. Unless someone had spent 3 years surviving by noticing tiny details, Ryan quickly removed the page before Ethan could study it. Another piece of the puzzle, another unanswered question. Meanwhile, Grace was assigned to clean the hallway outside Ryan's private office. Margaret handed her a feather duster. "Be quick." "Yes, ma'am." Grace began dusting the bookshelves lining the corridor. Ryan's office door remained slightly open. She had no intention of listening. Then she heard her own name. "New maid." Ryan said. Grace instinctively froze. Another unfamiliar voice replied, "She's harmless." "Don't care. You think she knows something." "I don't wait until people become dangerous." Silence followed, then Ryan spoke again. "Move her to another floor." "If Ethan notices," Ryan chuckled. "He won't." Grace's heart began pounding. Before she could quietly leave, footsteps echoed from the opposite hallway. She quickly resumed dusting just as Ryan opened the office door. His expression remained perfectly pleasant. "Everything all right?" "Yes, sir," Grace answered calmly. He studied her face. She gave nothing away. Ryan smiled. "Good." As he walked past, his shoulder lightly brushed hers. It looked accidental. It wasn't. He was testing her reaction. Grace remained composed. Ryan continued down the hallway, but a seed of suspicion had already taken root in his mind. He wasn't certain how much she had heard. He intended to find out. Later that afternoon, Grace entered Ethan's room with fresh linens. For the first time since she started working at the mansion, there was no nurse inside, only Ethan. The room felt strangely peaceful. She smiled warmly. "Looks like it's just us today." Ethan looked directly at her. His eyes seemed more alert than usual. Grace carefully changed the pillowcases before opening the curtains wider. "Weather is beautiful." She glanced toward the gardens. "I used to study outside whenever exams got stressful." A faint smile crossed her face as memories surfaced. Her nursing school classmates had often joked that Grace could memorize entire textbooks beneath a tree while everyone else struggled inside the library. One professor frequently told the class, "Knowledge makes you a nurse. Compassion makes you unforgettable." Those words had shaped Grace's life. Even after leaving school, she never stopped believing them. She turned back toward Ethan. "I still hope I'll finish someday." Ethan blinked slowly once, then twice. Grace paused again, the same pattern. This time she deliberately tested an idea. "If that means yes." She waited, blinked twice. Ethan's eyes widened then. 2 slow blinks. Grace's heart skipped. She wasn't imagining it. She smiled softly. "I knew it." Ethan felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Someone had finally noticed. Someone had understood. Grace pulled a chair beside him. "I don't know what the other signals mean yet." She laughed quietly. "But we'll figure them out." The first time in 3 years, Ethan felt less alone. Outside the bedroom, Nurse Linda returned carrying another syringe. She stopped in the doorway. Grace was sitting beside Ethan, talking to him, not as a patient, as a person. Linda immediately stepped back before either of them noticed. She hurried straight to Ryan's office. Ryan looked up as she entered. "What is it?" "The maid." "What about her?" "I think she's communicating with him." Ryan's smile vanished. "Explain." "I don't know how." But she asked him a question. And he answered. Ryan slowly stood. "Impossible. I saw it myself." Ryan walked toward the window overlooking the estate. His reflection stared back at him for the first time since Ethan's accident. Something had happened that Ryan couldn't control. He hated surprises, especially dangerous ones. That evening, after most employees had left, Martin Doyle quietly entered the mansion archives. For years, he had avoided looking through Ethan's father's private records. Tonight, guilt pushed him forward. Inside an old filing cabinet, he found a sealed envelope addressed in the late Richard Hawthorne's handwriting. It read, "To be opened only if Ethan's life is ever in danger." Martin's hands trembled. He reached for the envelope. Before he could touch it, a voice echoed behind him. "Working late?" Martin spun around. Ryan stood in the doorway, smiling. Martin quickly withdrew his hand. "Just organizing old records." Ryan's eyes briefly shifted toward the sealed envelope, only for a second, then back to Martin. "Be careful." His voice remained calm. "Some old files are better left untouched." Martin forced a smile. "Remember that." Ryan nodded and walked away. Only after his footsteps disappeared did Martin realize his palms were covered in sweat. Ryan knew, or at least, he suspected. The envelope remained inside the cabinet, waiting. Its contents had the potential to destroy everything Ryan had built over the last 3 years. As night settled over Hawthorne Mansion, Grace finished cleaning Ethan's room. Before leaving, she adjusted his blanket. "See you tomorrow." She turned toward the door behind her. Ethan gathered every ounce of strength his weakened body could produce. His right index finger twitched barely, less than an inch. Grace didn't see it, neither did the security camera, but Ethan did. It was the first voluntary movement he had made since the accident. A tiny victory, one that suggested his paralysis might not be as permanent as everyone believed. Across the mansion, Ryan sat alone in his office watching surveillance footage. He replayed the moment Grace discovered Ethan's blinking pattern. Again and again, his jaw tightened. Then he picked up his phone. "It's time," he said coldly. "Maid leaves work at 6 every evening." A voice answered from the other end. "What do you want us to do?" Ryan looked at Grace's smiling face frozen on the security monitor. His eyes turned icy. "By this time tomorrow, everyone in this mansion will believe she's a thief." He ended the call. Outside his office window, the lights of the city glittered peacefully. Inside Hawthorne Mansion, the first move in Ryan's brutal plan to humiliate and destroy the only woman who had brought hope back into Ethan Hawthorne's life had officially begun. By the time the sun began setting behind Hawthorne Mansion, Grace felt as though every muscle in her body had given up. 2 maids had called in sick that morning, forcing Margaret to divide their workload among the remaining staff. Grace had spent the entire day cleaning guest rooms, helping in the laundry, carrying supplies between floors, and assisting the kitchen staff after lunch. She hadn't eaten anything except a small piece of bread during a 5-minute break. Still, she never complained. As she wiped the sweat from her forehead, her phone vibrated inside her apron. It was Noah. She answered with a tired smile. "Hey, little man. Are you coming home soon?" "I'll be home as soon as I finish." "Wanted me to remind you not to skip dinner again." Grace forced a cheerful laugh. "I won't." It was another lie. She already knew there wasn't enough food at home for everyone. If she claimed she had eaten at work, her mother and Noah would finish the little that remained without worrying about her. "Tell Mom I love her." "I will." "Noah, working hard in school." "I promise." Call ended. Grace slipped the phone back into her pocket, blinked away the tears gathering in her eyes, and picked up a tray containing Ethan's evening meal. As she reached the second floor, she noticed the hallway was unusually quiet. Nurse Linda was nowhere to be seen. Margaret approached her. "The night nurse is running late." Grace nodded. "Should I leave the tray?" Margaret hesitated. "You studied nursing before coming here, didn't you?" Grace looked surprised. "Yes. I saw it in your employment file." Margaret sighed. "Help him finish his meal, then come straight back." "Will." Grace gently knocked before entering Ethan's room. "Good evening, Mr. Hawthorne." Ethan slowly turned his eyes toward her. For reasons he couldn't explain, the exhaustion on her face troubled him. She looked as though she had been carrying the weight of the world alone. Grace adjusted his bed, checked his posture just as she had been taught during nursing school, and patiently helped him finish dinner. "There we go," she said softly. "Much better." She noticed a novel resting on the bedside table. Its cover was worn with age. "Do you like adventure stories?" Ethan blinked twice. Grace smiled. Take that as a yes. She picked up the book. My dad used to read to me when I was little. He said stories make long days feel shorter. She opened to the bookmarked page. If you don't mind. She began reading. Her voice was calm, warm. Every character came alive through her gentle narration. For Ethan, the room slowly changed. He no longer saw medical equipment. He no longer heard the ticking clock. Instead, he remembered sitting beside his father many years earlier while listening to that very same novel. His father had laughed whenever Ethan tried guessing the ending before reaching the final chapter. Those had been simpler days, days before billions of dollars, before board meetings, before betrayal. Grace continued reading. Outside the room, Charles quietly passed by. He smiled to himself after hearing her voice. Maybe, he whispered under his breath, this house finally has some hope. Unknown to him, Ryan had just stepped out of his office. He heard the reading too. His expression darkened. He remained hidden at the end of the hallway, silently watching through the partially opened bedroom door. Inside, Grace reached the end of the chapter. She looked up. I think that's enough excitement for one night. She laughed softly. More tired than the hero in this book. She closed the novel and placed it back on the table. I'm just going to rest my eyes for 1 minute. She leaned back in the chair without realizing it. Her hand gently settled over Ethan's motionless hand. Within seconds, she was asleep. Her breathing became slow and peaceful. The room fell completely silent. Minutes passed. Then nearly an hour, Ethan slowly opened his eyes. The medication had begun wearing off. At first, he stared at the ceiling. Then he turned his eyes toward the chair. Grace was still asleep. Her head rested gently against the side of his bed. Her fingers remained wrapped around his hand. She wasn't pretending. She wasn't asking for anything. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She had simply become so exhausted while caring for him that sleep claimed her where she sat. For the first time in 3 years, someone was holding his hand without expecting money, power, influence, or inheritance in return. A tear rolled down Ethan's cheek. He remembered the day his father told him, "Son, you'll know who truly loves you by the way they treat you when you have nothing left to offer." Everyone else had seen a billionaire trapped inside a broken body. Grace had only seen a lonely man. Something deep inside Ethan finally broke free. The corners of his lips slowly lifted. It was only the faintest smile, but it was real. The first genuine smile he had worn since the accident. At that exact moment, a security guard passing the open doorway stopped in disbelief. He rubbed his eyes, then hurried down the hallway. "Nurse Linda," she looked up. "What is it? You need to see this." Linda hurried into the room. Her mouth fell open. My goodness. Within minutes, 2 doctors, Charles, Margaret, and several employees quietly gathered outside the room. None of them had seen Ethan smile in 3 years. Some couldn't believe their eyes. Others became emotional. Charles discreetly wiped away a tear. Margaret smiled for the first time in days. Only one person wasn't happy: Ryan. Standing at the back of the gathering, his face remained perfectly calm. Inside, he was furious. 3 years of emotional isolation, destroyed by one poor maid in a single evening. He quietly turned and walked away before anyone noticed the anger burning behind his eyes. Before this heartbreaking story takes another shocking turn, take just 2 seconds to support the channel. If you're enjoying this emotional journey, please subscribe and help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. We're only at 200 subscribers right now, and every single subscription helps us bring you more unforgettable stories like this. And don't forget to leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We'd love to know which part of the world you're joining us from. Now, let's continue, because everything is about to fall apart. Ryan entered his private office and immediately called the head of security. "Need you here." Minutes later, the man arrived. Ryan opened a velvet box. Inside lay Ethan's rare Swiss wristwatch, a family heirloom worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. "Have a job for you," the guard hesitated. "What kind of job?" Ryan's smile turned cold. "Tomorrow morning. This watch will be found inside Grace Carter's locker." The guard's face stiffened. "Is there a problem?" "No, there shouldn't be." Ryan placed the watch into a small evidence bag. "Once she's accused, the rest will happen naturally." "What if she denies it?" Ryan laughed quietly. "Who do you think they'll believe? The poor maid? Or the Hawthorne family. The next morning unfolded exactly as Ryan had planned. Just after the staff meeting, a loud shout echoed through the servant quarters. "My watch!" Several employees turned. Margaret frowned. "What happened?" Ryan walked into the room holding an empty watch case. "My cousin's watch is missing." Silence filled the room. Security officers immediately locked the exits. Every employee looked nervous. Ryan spoke calmly. "No one leaves until every locker is searched." Grace's heart began racing. She had done nothing wrong. One by one, lockers were opened. Nothing. Then, a security officer opened Grace's locker. His eyes widened. He slowly lifted the watch into the air. The room gasped. Grace stared in horror. "No, that's impossible. Never seen that watch before." Ryan lowered his head as if disappointed. "I didn't want to believe it." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Swear I didn't take it." Margaret looked genuinely shocked. Charles immediately stepped forward. "There has to be some mistake." Ryan's voice became firm. "Evidence is right there." Security guards grabbed Grace's arm. She struggled. "I didn't steal anything. You have to believe me." Her desperate cries echoed through the mansion upstairs. Ethan heard every word. His heart pounded violently. When Grace's voice reached his room, he knew something terrible was happening. With every ounce of strength he possessed, he forced his barely responsive finger onto the emergency call button beside his bed. Once, twice, again. The alarm blared through Hawthorne Mansion. Doctors and nurses rushed toward Ethan's room. Downstairs, in the confusion, Grace was dragged toward the front entrance as tears streamed down her face. She looked back only once, toward the staircase, as though hoping someone, anyone, would believe her innocence. She never saw Ethan desperately pressing the emergency button again and again, fighting with every remaining ounce of strength to stop the woman who had brought light back into his broken world from being taken away. Outside, hidden in the mansion's surveillance room, a technician noticed something unusual. The hallway footage from the servant lockers had just been remotely deleted. He frowned. Who authorized this? His computer displayed only one message: executive access granted. The technician immediately stood up. "Have to report this." The surveillance room door slowly creaked open behind him. He turned. His face instantly turned pale. "Why, you?" The surveillance technician instinctively stepped backward until his legs touched the edge of his desk. His heartbeat pounded inside his chest. The computer monitor still displayed the words, "executive access." A handful of people inside Hawthorne Mansion possessed that level of authorization. He slowly looked toward the doorway. His face turned completely pale. The visitor quietly closed the door. The technician opened his mouth to speak again. No words came out. The security cameras inside the surveillance room continued recording for only a few more seconds. Then, every screen suddenly went black. Meanwhile, outside the mansion, Grace stood beside the massive iron gates, clutching the small canvas bag that contained all her belongings. Her uniform was wrinkled. Her eyes were swollen from crying. Two security guards waited until she walked beyond the property before silently returning inside. No one came after her. No one apologized. No one asked for her side of the story. The accusation had destroyed her reputation in less than 10 minutes. Grace stopped walking. She looked back one final time at Hawthorne Mansion. "I didn't steal anything," she whispered to herself. A tear rolled down her cheek. Then another. She turned and continued toward the nearest bus stop. Unknown to her, Charles watched from an upstairs window. His heart broke. For the first time in 23 years of serving the Hawthorne family, he felt ashamed to wear the mansion's uniform. Deep inside, he no longer believed Grace was guilty. He remembered the way she had carefully folded Ethan's blanket, the way she greeted every employee by name, the way she quietly shared her lunch with one of the gardeners 2 days earlier after noticing he had forgotten his own meal. People like Grace did not suddenly become thieves. Something was terribly wrong. Charles made a silent promise: find the truth. It was a small decision, one that would eventually place his own life in danger. Inside Ethan's bedroom, chaos filled the room. Doctors rushed around his bed while monitors beeped loudly. What happened? His heart rate suddenly spiked. Check his oxygen. Nurse Linda glanced toward the emergency button. He kept pressing it. Another doctor frowned. Why? Nobody had an answer. Ethan stared desperately toward the bedroom door. He wasn't worried about himself. He was thinking about Grace. His breathing became uneven. Every instinct told him she was in trouble. He tried forcing his lips to move, nothing. He tried lifting his hand, nothing. Only his eyes continued searching the doorway. Ryan entered moments later wearing a carefully crafted expression of concern. "Is my cousin all right?" The doctors nodded. "He's stabilizing." Ryan slowly walked toward Ethan. Once the others turned their attention back to the medical monitors, Ryan leaned close enough that only Ethan could hear. "You really should stop fighting." His smile never reached his eyes. "No one is coming to save her." Ryan straightened his jacket before addressing the doctors. "Give him the very best care." Then he calmly walked away, Ethan's heart filled with helpless rage. For the first time since the accident, he wanted revenge, not for himself, for Grace. Hours later, Grace finally reached the small apartment she shared with her family. The building looked nothing like Hawthorne Mansion. Peeling paint covered the walls. Several windows had been repaired with cardboard. Children played soccer in the narrow courtyard using a worn-out ball held together with tape. Grace climbed the stairs slowly. Every step felt heavier than the last. She reached her apartment door, then stopped. An eviction notice had been taped to it. Her hands began trembling. She slowly removed the paper. Final notice. Rent overdue. Vacate the property within 72 hours for several seconds. He simply stared. She had planned to use her next paycheck to pay the landlord now. There would be no paycheck. Before she could process the shock, her phone rang. The hospital. Grace answered immediately. "Carter?" "Yes. This is St. Matthew Medical Center." Her stomach tightened. "Your mother's dialysis treatment scheduled for tomorrow has been suspended." Grace's voice cracked. "What? We still haven't received payment for the outstanding balance. Please." Tears streamed down her face. "She needs that treatment." "Very sorry. Policy doesn't allow us to continue until the account is brought up to date." Line went silent. Grace lowered the phone. Her body gave out beneath her. She collapsed onto the apartment hallway floor. Years of carrying everyone else's burdens finally became too much. For the first time since her father's funeral, she cried without trying to hide it. The apartment door suddenly opened. Noah rushed outside, wrapped his small arms around her. Emily, pale from illness, slowly stepped into the hallway. "What happened?" Grace quickly wiped away her tears. She couldn't tell them, not yet. She forced a weak smile. "I just had a really hard day." Emily gently touched her daughter's face. "You lost your job." Grace looked up in surprise. "How did you know?" "A mother always knows." Emily pulled her into a hug. "I'm sorry." Grace buried her face against her mother's shoulder. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect us." Emily softly shook her head. "Been protecting us for years." Neither of them noticed a black luxury SUV parked across the street. Its windows were heavily tinted. Someone inside quietly watched the apartment building. The engine remained running. The mysterious passenger never stepped outside. Instead, a phone was lifted. A photograph of Grace was quietly taken. The vehicle remained there for another 15 minutes before slowly driving away. Grace never knew she was being watched. Not by Ryan, not by the police, someone else. Someone whose identity remained hidden. The reason for the surveillance was still unknown, but the audience had already been given small clues throughout the story that forces beyond Ryan's control were beginning to move. Back at Hawthorne Mansion, darkness settled over the estate. Most employees had gone home. Martin Doyle remained alone inside the library. He couldn't stop thinking about Grace, or the missing surveillance footage, or the sealed envelope hidden inside Richard Hawthorne's private cabinet. He looked toward the grandfather clock, almost midnight. His conscience finally defeated his fear. He quietly walked back into the archives. The envelope remained exactly where he had seen it earlier. His trembling fingers reached toward it this time. He picked it up. Before opening it, he whispered, "I hope I'm not already too late." Contents remained unseen. Not yet. Some truths needed the proper moment to be revealed. Elsewhere inside the mansion, doctors had finally left Ethan's room. Only a night nurse remained. She quietly adjusted his blanket before noticing something unusual. Ethan's right index finger moved, barely, but enough. She quickly placed his communication tablet on the adjustable stand beside the bed. "Take your time." Ethan stared at the screen. The effort was exhausting. His finger trembled violently as it hovered above the letters. One letter, then another. Each movement cost him enormous effort. Minutes passed, sweat formed across his forehead. The nurse waited patiently. Finally, The message appeared. She read it once, then again. Her face turned completely pale. 4 simple words: find Grace. Trust nobody. She slowly looked toward Ethan. His eyes pleaded with her, not as a billionaire, not as a patient, but as a man desperately trying to protect the only person who had shown him genuine kindness in 3 long years. The nurse quietly nodded. I understand. Outside Ethan's bedroom, hidden in the darkness at the end of the hallway, another figure had been watching through the slightly open door. The person quietly stepped backward before disappearing into the shadows. Whoever it was, they now knew Ethan had finally found a way to communicate. And if Ryan discovered that message before Grace could be found, the danger facing her would become far greater than losing a job. Far beyond Hawthorne Mansion, Grace sat beside the window of her tiny apartment, unable to sleep. She looked up at the night sky. She still had no idea that a lonely billionaire was fighting with everything he had left to find her. She also had no idea that powerful enemies were already making their next move. The battle over the Hawthorne fortune had only just begun, and in the end, only one side would walk away with everything.